An ex-soldier took in an injured stray dog. The words echoed in Mason Kelly's mind as he stared at the trembling ball of matted fur huddled against the dumpster behind his apartment building. The irony wasn't lost on him. Broken souls recognizing each other in the rain. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left Mason with more than just the jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw. The invisible wounds ran deeper. Nightmares that jolted him awake at 3 a.m. The way his heart hammered against his ribs when a car backfired. How crowds made his skin feel 2 sizes too small. The Army had discharged him with honors, medication, and therapy appointments he rarely kept. They couldn't discharge the memories. The dog growled weakly as Mason approached, its right hind leg bent at an unnatural angle. Rain pelted them both, turning the alley into a small river of cigarette butts and forgotten dreams. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mason whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. When was the last time he'd spoken to anyone besides the convenience store clerk or his VA counselor? "I'm just as screwed up as you are." The dog's eyes, one blue, one brown, regarded him with equal parts fear and resignation. Mason recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own reflection more times than he cared to count. Removing his jacket despite the November chill, Mason draped it carefully over the dog. The animal flinched but didn't bite as Mason gently scooped it up, feeling ribs through soaked fur. "I don't know much about dogs," Mason muttered as they entered his sparse apartment. 3 years back from the war, and the place still looked like he'd moved in yesterday. No pictures on the walls, minimal furniture, nothing personal except the folded flag in a shadow box on the bookshelf. A tribute to Ramirez, who never made it home. Mason fashioned a makeshift bed from an old blanket, placed a bowl of water nearby, and called the only vet open at this hour. The earliest appointment was tomorrow morning. "Looks like it's just you and me tonight," he told the dog, who watched his every move with wary eyes. "I'm not much for company, but I've got heat and it's dry." Sleep came in fragments that night. Mason kept checking on the dog, expecting it to have somehow escaped or died. But each time, those mismatched eyes would blink back at him in the darkness. Alive, present, waiting. The vet, Dr. Abernathy, according to her name tag, was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and hands that moved with gentle confidence. "He's been through quite an ordeal," she said, examining the dog. "Broken leg, malnourished, some old scars that suggest this isn't his first time in trouble. But he's a fighter." Mason stood awkwardly in the exam room, hands shoved in his pockets. "Sure, can you fix him?" "Doctor." Abernathy looked up, her eyes lingering on Mason's scar before meeting his gaze. "I can set the leg, treat the infections, help with the physical healing. The rest takes time." Something in her tone made Mason wonder if she was still talking about the dog. "He's about 2 years old, some kind of shepherd mix. No microchip. Do you want to leave him here? The shelter can take him once he's stable." The dog's eyes found Mason's across the room. "No," Mason said, surprising himself. "I'll keep him. For now. He'll need care. Medication." "Patience. Doctor, Abernathy's voice was gentle but firm. "Are you up for that?" Mason thought about his empty apartment, the silence broken only by his own nightmares, the days that bled into each other without purpose or meaning. "Yeah," he said. "I can handle it." He named the dog Scout, not for any particular reason. The name just came to him on the walk home. The dog, a warm weight against his chest, sedated after having his legs set and placed in a cast. "Scout?" Mason tried out loud. The dog's ear twitched. The first week was an adjustment for both of them. Mason had to carry Scout outside for bathroom breaks, which meant actually leaving his apartment multiple times a day, something he'd avoided when possible. He found himself nodding at neighbors he'd previously ignored, exchanging brief pleasantries about the weather as Scout did his business. Scout needed pills twice daily, hidden in small portions of the bland chicken and rice diet Dr. Abernathy had recommended. Mason set alarms on his phone, creating the first real schedule he'd followed since leaving the Army. At night, Scout whimpered in his sleep, small, broken sounds that made Mason's chest ache with recognition. "You're okay," he'd murmur, reaching down to stroke Scout's head. "You're safe now." Words he wished someone would say to him and mean it. The pills Mason had been prescribed, for anxiety, for depression, for sleep, remained mostly untouched in his bathroom cabinet. The side effects made him feel foggy, disconnected, and he'd rather face the demons head-on than feel nothing at all. But watching Scout dutifully swallow his antibiotics, Mason felt like a hypocrite. On day 10, he swallowed his own pills for the first time in months. By week 3, Scout was putting tentative weight on his casted leg. Mason found himself researching dog care online, ordering proper food, toys, a comfortable bed, though Scout seemed to prefer the couch next to Mason. The apartment began transforming. Dog bowls in the kitchen, a leash hanging by the door, fur on everything despite Mason's daily vacuuming. "You're expensive," Mason told Scout one evening as he scanned his depleted bank account. The medical bills, special food and supplies had taken a chunk out of his disability payments. Might need to look for some work. Scout thumped his tail against the couch cushion as if approving this plan. The next day, Mason did something he hadn't done in nearly a year. He walked into town, resume in hand. Scout limped faithfully alongside him, the blue harness that identified him as in training, a suggestion from Dr. Abernathy, drawing smiles rather than the wary looks Mason usually received. Henderson's Hardware was a family-owned store that had somehow survived the arrival of the big box retailers on the edge of town. The bell above the door jingled as Mason entered, Scout pressing against his leg. "No dogs," began the gray-haired man behind the counter, before noticing the harness. "Oh, service dog?" "Training," Mason clarified, his voice rough. "I can leave him outside if—" No. The man waved a hand. "Frank Henderson. This is my place. What can I do for you?" Mason held out his crumpled resume. "Looking for work. I have experience with tools, basic construction. I was a combat engineer in the Army." Frank studied the paper, then studied Mason. "When did you get back?" 3 years ago. Frank nodded slowly. "My son did 2 tours in Iraq. Never talks about it." He glanced down at Scout, who sat patiently at Mason's feet. "Dog helping?" Mason's hand dropped instinctively to Scout's head. "We're helping each other." Something in Frank's expression softened. "I could use someone 3 days a week. Nothing fancy, stocking, helping customers find what they need. Maybe some deliveries to the older folks who can't make it in." "I can do that," Mason said, feeling a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Purpose." "Dog comes too," Frank added. "Good for business. People love dogs." And so a routine formed. 3 days a week, Mason and Scout walked the mile to Henderson's Hardware. Mason stocked shelves, answered questions about tools he could practically disassemble in his sleep, loaded supplies into customers' vehicles. Scout became the store's unofficial mascot, greeting customers with a gentle wag, staying close to Mason when the store got busy and Mason's breathing grew shallow. On their days off, they explored the town Mason had lived in but never really seen. The park with its winding trails. The farmer's market on Saturdays, where an elderly woman named Ruth always saved a meaty soup bone for that sweet dog with the funny eyes. The coffee shop where the barista, Elena, started remembering Mason's order, black, no sugar, and having it ready when she spotted them through the window. Mason's apartment continued its transformation. A bookshelf appeared, then books to fill it. Mostly about dogs at first, then history, then novels Elena recommended. A plant sat on the windowsill. "Impossible to kill," Ruth from the farmer's market had promised, pressing it into his hands. "Just like you and that dog of yours." The nightmares didn't disappear, but they changed. Sometimes now, in the middle of the fire and blood and Ramirez's face, Scout would appear, leading Mason out of the burning building, away from the memories that couldn't hurt him anymore. When Scout's cast came off, Dr. Abernathy declared him good as new, maybe better. "You too," she added, looking at Mason. "You're looking better than when I first met you." Mason rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the observation but unable to deny it. He'd gained some weight, lost the hollow-eyed look. He'd even gotten a haircut last week. "It's the dog," he said. "Doctor," Abernathy smiled. "It usually is." 6 months after Mason found Scout in that alley, they had a rhythm, a life. Not perfect. Mason still had days when leaving the apartment felt impossible, when the memories pressed too close and the world seemed too loud, too bright, too much. On those days, Scout would rest his head on Mason's knee, those mismatched eyes patient, waiting for the storm to pass. And it always did. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It started normally enough. Mason woke at 6 a.m., swallowed his pills with a glass of water, took Scout for his morning walk. They headed to Henderson's for their regular shift, stopping at Elena's coffee shop on the way. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for a cup. "Thanks," Mason said, counting out exact change. He'd been trying to work up the courage to actually talk to her. Really talk, not just this transaction they repeated 3 times a week. She had a smile that made him think of sunlight through leaves, And sometimes when their fingers brushed during the handoff of his coffee, Mason felt a jolt of something he'd thought long dead. But not today. Today he just nodded his thanks, and they continued to the hardware store. The morning passed quietly. Mason restocked the nail bins, helped Mrs. Donovan pick out the right light bulbs for her dining room fixture, unloaded a shipment of power tools. Scout napped in his spot by the register, occasionally greeting customers with a lazy tail wag. It was nearly closing time when the bell above the door jangled. Mason was in the back, breaking down empty boxes, but he heard Frank's greeting fade into an unusual silence. Scout's growl reached Mason before he registered anything else wrong. Low, warning, a sound he'd never heard from his normally gentle dog. When Mason stepped into the main store area, he instantly cataloged the scene with the hyper-awareness that had once kept him alive in combat. Two men in hoodies despite the warm spring day, one by the register speaking to Frank in low, urgent tones, the other blocking the door. The first man's hand was in his pocket, and Frank's face had gone ashen. A robbery. Mason stepped back into the shadows of the stockroom, mind racing. Call the police? The store phone was at the front. His cell was in his jacket, hanging right next to the men. Frank kept a shotgun under the counter, but reaching for it might escalate things. Before Mason could decide on a course of action, several things happened at once. Frank's hand moved under the counter, reaching for the panic button or the gun. Mason couldn't tell. The man at the register saw the movement and pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing a pistol. And Scout, loyal, protective Scout, launched himself from his spot with a snarl, clamping his teeth around the gunman's wrist. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. The second man bolted for the door as Scout wrestled the first to the ground. Mason moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 strides. He grabbed the gunman's arm, applying pressure to the nerve point the way he'd been trained, forcing the weapon from fingers already slick with blood from Scout's bite. Stay down, Mason ordered, voice deadly calm as he secured the gun. The police are already on their way. They weren't, but the bluff worked. The man stopped struggling, his eyes wide with fear as Scout continued to growl inches from his face. Frank had indeed hit the silent alarm. 4 minutes later, police cruisers pulled up outside, lights flashing. In the chaos that followed, statements, evidence collection, paramedics checking the bite on the would-be robber's arm, Mason kept one hand on Scout's head, grounding himself in the solid warmth of his dog. "Your dog saved my life," Frank said later, after the police had taken the gunman away. His hands were still shaking. If he hadn't reacted, that guy was going to shoot. Mason looked down at Scout, who had returned to his normal calm self, leaning against Mason's leg as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He knew, Mason said simply. He knew something was wrong. That night, Mason couldn't sleep, not from nightmares, but from the realization that kept circling in his mind. Scout had sensed danger and acted without hesitation to protect them. The dog Mason had saved him in return. But it was more than that. Over the past 6 months, Scout had been saving Mason in 100 small ways, from isolation, from despair, from a half-life lived in the shadows of what had been lost. As dawn broke, Mason made a decision. He waited until a reasonable hour, then called Dr. Abernathy's office. "I want to get Scout certified as a service dog," he said when she came on the line. "Properly trained. Not just for me. There are other veterans who could benefit from what he's given me." There was a pause, then Dr. Abernathy's warm voice. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Mason. I know just the trainer to refer you to." 3 days later, Mason stood outside Elena's coffee shop, Scout at his side. Through the window, he could see her arranging pastries in the display case, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "What do you think, Scout? Should I ask her out?" Scout's tail wagged once, decisively. Mason took a deep breath and pushed open the door. "The usual?" Elena asked, her smile brightening when she saw them. "Actually," Mason said, his heart pounding, but his voice steady, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner sometime. With me. And not Scout," he added quickly. "Though he highly recommends it." Elena's laugh was worth every second of nervousness. "I thought you'd never ask." 1 year to the day after Mason found Scout in that rain-soaked alley, he stood before a group of veterans at the local VA center. Scout sat alertly at his side, now wearing an official service dog vest. "This dog saved my life," Mason told the group, his voice strong and clear. "Not just that day at the hardware store, but every day since I found him, or he found me." He looked out at the faces watching him, some openly curious, others guarded, all carrying burdens visible and invisible. Sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms. He continued, sometimes it's wet and has fur and needs you as much as you need it. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Scout and I are here to talk about the service dog program we're helping to establish. But more than that, we're here to tell you that healing is possible. Connection is possible. A life after war is possible. Scout pressed against Mason's leg, a warm, solid reminder of how far they'd both come. Later that evening, Mason and Scout walked home in the gentle spring twilight. Elena would be coming over for dinner, a regular occurrence now. The apartment that had once been so empty was now filled with life. Photos on the walls, Scout's toys scattered across the floor, the smell of herbs growing on the windowsill. As they turned the corner onto their street, Mason spotted a huddled shape beside a dumpster. His step faltered. A cat, thin and matted, one ear torn, watched them warily. Scout whined softly, looking up at Mason. Mason sighed, then smiled. What do you think, Scout? Room for one more broken soul? Scout's tail wagged once, decisively, and together they approached the cat, ready to begin another journey of healing. The kind that saved not just one life, but rippled outward in endless circles of compassion and hope. Sometimes, Mason thought, the most wounded healers were the most powerful of all.